Great, thanks. Well, it's great to be here, and thanks Joaquin and Laurel for that plug on OpenET. That they gave a great perspective on a lot of the things that we're faced with in this project, and hopefully things that we'll be able to provide. First, I'd like to thank Forrest Melton, my colleague from Cal State Monterey Bay and NASA Ames. Full disclosure, I'm the backup speaker. He was actually invited for this talk. I'm from the Desert Research Institute. I'm a research professor of hydrology there from Reno, Nevada. So it's a pleasure to be here in California talking about some of our work. First off, I'd like to give acknowledgement to our partners, the Environmental Defense Fund, Google Earth Engine, and a whole host of academic and federal partners. Just kind of going to the point of one of the questions, including the academics, I think is really important, as well as the federal and also nonprofits. So evapotranspiration, why are we talking about that at a water quality symposium, or at least focused on water quality? Well, it really does impact water quality in many ways, and thinking about how to kind of frame this. Evapotranspiration, or latent heat flux, it's the hidden energy. It's Latin for hidden, latent. It's really this hidden component in the water budget. And if we want to, for example, calculate nitrogen loadings from irrigation, we have to have that flux of infiltrated water, recharge. And oftentimes we can't calculate that directly. We calculate it as a residual of the water balance application rates minus this evapotranspiration. So this is really critical, not only for water resources, but also water quality. Agriculture is by far the biggest consumer of water in the Western U.S. Why is evapotranspiration useful? We use it in a lot of ways to kind of provide that maximum amount of plant water use. That's the potential evapotranspiration, but also to establish water budgets. And we want to do that using the best available science to derive the actual evapotranspiration, not the potential. A lot of our models, water quality models, water budget models, are using the potential, assuming a well-watered crop. And in a lot of places that happens in California, but of course in a lot of other places in the West it does not. There's a lot of deficit irrigation, there's shortage. And really the only way we can estimate evapotranspiration over large areas and time periods is with remote sensing. We can use eddy flux stations or in situ stations or ground measurements, water budget measurements of evapotranspiration at the field scale, but really we got to scale this up. We're going to use it for supporting conservation and innovation, giving proper credit for reduced use, that's a big deal, and also reducing the monitoring costs and support water trading and reduction programs, and to improve on-farm efficiencies. So where we were in 1988-ish, tapes, very expensive Landsat imagery, thousands of dollars per image, and we have imagery going back to 1985 with Landsat 5 every 16 days, now with Landsat 8 and 7 every 8 days. And nowadays it's free, it's open. We've opened up the Landsat archive. And now we have supercomputers. We have a whole constellation of satellites where we're fusing together European satellites with American satellites, and it's really an exciting time. But there are now tons and tons of petabytes of data that we have to process to, for example, calculate evapotranspiration since 1985 for every field over the planet. Well, how are we going to do this? Many of you have probably heard of Google Earth Engine. We are relying on Google Earth Engine to help us. It's a change, it's really a paradigm shift where before I remember spending hours and hours, I'm a hydrologist, and downloading terabytes of data to my hard drive to run my MATLAB codes or Python codes locally. And nowadays it's the opposite. We're bringing our algorithms to the data, to the cloud, and processing all this stuff in the cloud. So it's really changing the way we're approaching remote sensing, and also integrating the climate into all this. And how do we do it? Well, Google has essentially built this API called Google Earth Engine, and because every pixel is independent of its neighbor, Their API integrates this massive parallelization procedure where they break up the images into 256 by 256 blocks and say if you want a max normalized difference vegetation index over a time period, it sends out that calculation to thousands of computers simultaneously to figure that out, and then it stitches the images back together again in real time. So there's a whole host of intrinsic functions within the API which we're utilizing, and it's really, again, changed the paradigm of how we approach this big data problem. So now that we have the calculations and the scaling available to us, the problem and the challenge is really what to do with all that data and to organize it all. And to Joaquin's point, make it useful at the end of the day. And so it's great we have evapotranspiration rasters, but really what we need to spatially average all this data to the fields. Then we got to make histograms of what the water use rates are, and then turn those results into something that is meaningful where a user can just click on a polygon, a field, and be able to get the data through a web interface. So that's really where OpenET comes from. Is one of the goals is to provide easily accessible data to everyone, rather than the way it is currently, where you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for data through a consultant. They're kind of one-off studies. They aren't scalable, and they don't go back far in time. Trust, as was mentioned before, is a really big deal. We have to have trust. And from a regulatory perspective, the regulators love something like this. It's super useful, but really for this stuff to stick, it's got to be used by both the growers, the end-use partners, as well as the regulators. And ultimately, we want them to use this stuff just as much as the regulatory community. Sustainable resource management and practices are enabled. So without this data, it's hard to, for example, monitor all water use in the whole Central Valley. But with something like this, I feel like a whole host of opportunities will start to arise, including the water quality perspective, which we really haven't even thought about to a large extent. So why is it needed? Well, right now the cost is high for something like this that's scalable. And with OpenET, it will be low. Compatibility and trust. So right now, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of different models out there. How are we going to deal with uncertainty? And so we've surrounded ourselves by the best of the best in the field, and the best. Well, I say the best models, but to the most widely accepted models that have been used in a lot of litigation and worldwide studies. The scope is broad, the accessibility is high, and currently it's not. So the project design and execution, we developed the platform around the water community and the end-use partners. They are telling us what they need. We aren't coming at this from a top-down approach, as often happens with academics. We are building this from the bottom up based on what the needs are. And so we're working with a diverse set of end-use case partners. You can see there are many in California, but also across the whole entire Western U.S. We are partnering with experts, as I mentioned. Many in California are really guiding the development, including the water board. Brent Vandenberg has been a big help, as well as some academics from UC Davis, Josue Ozura from UC Davis, as well as consulting firms, Byron Clark from David's Engineering, for example. We are holding a lot of different workshops and building on our existing state and federal partnerships, where this is our computer lab at the Desert Research Institute, where we're working with the state agency personnel, GIS technicians, water rights surveyors, and showing them how to make these maps and enabling them to be able to run these codes in-house and really be able to understand this stuff, because they're going to be using it for decision making. So It's been a really great exercise on just how to do the stakeholder involvement and outreach and training with our current partners. Some of the comments that we got back: open lines of communication with technical staff via GitHub and Slack. So, we're trying to get hip and bring in that new culture of collaborative coding with GitHub and Slack, and it's full version control, and we're submitting GitHub issues all the time. We have a whole technical staff that just handles that stuff day in to day out. And really, without the open and free Landsat data, agencies would not be able to track water use at large scales. So there was some rumor that USGS was going to start charging again for Landsat data. And as far as I know, at the Landsat science team meeting that we just had 2 weeks ago, that's not going to happen. Again, bringing communities together and building trust. So when we make our ET maps, we go out to the growers and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? You think 3 feet per year is about right? 2.5? What do you guys think of these results? And getting their feedback and input is really critical for this. So we aren't just in the office cranking stuff out. We're out in the field working with the growers. I'm going to shift to the platform development. That's really where I focus on. And essentially the architecture is we have the satellites, the ground stations, we have these big data centers, and then Google's scraping all the data so we can use their massive cloud computing platform. And then we have the application programming interface, the API. That's central to the whole architecture. Then we have this massive geodatabase of spatially averaged field ET rates, and then the user interface. The specific architecture, we're using the UTM military grid reference system tiling scheme for all this. And we're going to have both raster data and field boundaries available. The rasters are 30-meter resolution. We're going to have evapotranspiration, the fraction of reference evapotranspiration, so scaled from essentially 0 to 1. And then the reference evapotranspiration, or the potential, and then, of course, the NDVI, or the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is a measure of the vegetation vigor. We're going to have a command line as well as a HTML API interface. So if you wanted to just say, hey, I want to download monthly ET rates for this big box as a geotiff since 1990, you'll be able to get a stack of geotiffs for your study area. The model runs and the zonal stats and the raster API are powered by Google Earth Engine, whereas the field polygon and post-processing and visualization in the Data Explorer page is powered by GeoServer and PostGIS GIS database. So the models that we're running on Google Earth Engine and we'll be summarizing the results for are listed here. Again, these are some of the most, well, probably the most commonly used ET models out there. And metric in particular has been used in a lot of litigation across the West, and many of these others have been to some degree as well. So, and CBOP, the USGS model here on the right, upper right, that's being currently used for the National Water Census. So, we're bringing in both the academic and federal partners here. So we've done some implementations of these models on Earth Engine. This is really the first CONUS-wide test here shown on the left with CBOP. And then SIMS, the Satellite Irrigation Management System, that's from NASA and CSUMB and being applied commonly in the Central Valley. So as I mentioned, OpenET leverages multiple models as well as a constellation of satellites, Landsat, MODIS, the Terra Aqua, and these other ones down here on the bottom, including the ESA Sentinel-2A and 2B, 10-meter resolution, 5-day return times, so we can calculate NDVI and really be able to track that crop phenology in time and space. Here's a first glance at the user interface where we're going to have a field view, both field view and raster view, where you'll be able to zoom into your field and pull out the ET. And here is a image of South Dakota, the Missouri River. These are fields. field polygons, millions and millions of fields. So we've gone through this field level database that were originally drawn by a human, by the Farm Services Agency, and they were made available online, but taken down in 2008. The government was getting quite a bit of flack for that, but we got this stuff long ago. And we've been cleaning these field boundaries up and blending them with other field boundaries that we've been able to download from state agencies that are also manually derived. So there's a lot of overlaps, there's a lot of slivers, there's a lot of duplicates, so we've written a process to clean all this stuff up. Just this data set alone is super valuable to have a really clean polygon level data set of all fields in the whole country. And we'll have hover over and on-click spatially averaged variables mentioned there. So there's over 45 million vector tiles at zoom level 15. So we're using GeoServer to serve up these vector tiles. And the data gets passed to your browser. And you'll be able to hover over fields and be able to see the monthly ET rates on hover over and be able to click to get more details. It's a very big effort. And then you'll be able to do reporting. So you'll be able to set your requirements, whether you want a one-time reporting or reoccurring reporting, be able to draw a box and be able to get reports of your ET rates for your areas of interest. Upload your own shape files, use your own Earth Engine feature collection if you have that. And then be able to scroll through your saved reports. So once you submit the request, it'll crunch. If it's a big request, it'll give you a notification, hopefully not too many days later, and then be able to scroll through your reports and your summaries at your leisure. A big part of the process is the accuracy assessment. You know, we can crank out data all day long now that we have the compute power, but we really need to do the accuracy assessment. So we're doing this by validating against all the Ameriflux, EddyFlux station data across the country, as well as FluxNet 2015, and also using groundwater pumpage. So linking the pumpage to the fields is really challenging. We have all this pumpage data, that's great. We have the field polygons. Good luck trying to tag the field attributes with the pumpage and sorting through all those permits to do that. That's been a real challenge. They've done it in Southeast Oregon. We're using some of that data to validate. And the fits aren't too bad between the ET and the groundwater pumpage for a lot of these center pivots in Southeast Oregon. And then also the model intercomparison. That is a very important piece, and we're learning a ton of how our models are responding to different areas. This is a difference map between CBOP and SIMS. SIMS is a vegetation index-based model, so there are a lot of these red areas. This is where SIMS was lower than CBOP. And these are rice fields in the Colusa area. And because the vegetation index goes down when you have flooded fields, it doesn't see that evaporation occurring because a vegetation index just does not, whereas CBOP is based on thermal data, surface temperature, and it does see that evaporative cooling effect. So since this comparison, there's been some modifications made to SIMS for situations like this where the NDWI, the water index, is high, the vegetation index is low. We can start to modify the model to make it evaporate water as it should. So we're learning a ton from just comparing these models together and other models at scale that really has never been done before like this. And also we're building on research and investment from California water agencies. So this intercomparison study in the Delta is super, super helpful for us and building on that. And then also the CIMIS network, big investment by the state. We use that data day in and day out, so really good there. Just an example of this intercomparison study in the Delta where they compared models head-to-head for different crop types and summarizing the volumes of ET by crop type, and just, you know, reassuring that a lot of the models were at least similar to one another. There are some big differences in some cases, but you this goes to the question earlier about what do you do with multiple answers, and the idea for us is we're going to have an ensemble and then we're going to have a range. And there will be certain cases where certain models outperform others, and we'll note that. And so we're going to have some guidelines and recommendations on when and where to use certain models over others. So opportunities for California water use reporting, SB 88 obviously is going to be a natural fit. Sigma implementation, again, a natural fit. Even if we are measuring all groundwater use, which will be a long ways out, really what we want is how much leaves to the atmosphere, because some of that groundwater use goes back. And so ET is going to be central to this, no matter if we are metering all water use or not. Improving efficiencies, and then, of course, water transactions, I think it'll really be helpful for. And with that, take any questions. Thanks.
All right, thanks. Will each individual model output be available? And also, will there be some estimate of uncertainty associated with the data?
Yes, we'll have every model available. And as far as uncertainty, we will have some QA flags and a level of confidence. For example, if you only have one observation in a month, that uncertainty will be higher than if you have two. So there will be some QA flags, but in terms of a really rigorous quantification of uncertainty using Monte Carlo analysis or something like that, that's beyond the scope. But we will have a QA and level of confidence depending on how many observations primarily we have each month.
Thanks. Great talk. Can you share a little bit about how the conversations with the growers and farmers went? Were there any surprising reactions from them that you guys weren't expecting? Was it generally positive? Were your results?
Yeah, that's a great question. Initially, we were expecting negative reactions. We're the eye in the sky, monitoring their use. And turns out they've been really supportive. And I think it's because there's regulations coming down, and specifically in Nevada, where this particular basin, Diamond Valley, is being ordered to, well, the growers are being ordered to reduce their consumptive use or their pumpage by 40% in the next 20 years. And it's a self-reporting system on their pumpage, and they want to make sure that if one person is doing it, everybody's got to do it. So even with the self-reporting system, they may type an extra 0 or not enough digits in the reporting system. So they want transparency, and they want a backup system that just gives them some reassurance that everybody's participating in the plan. So they are very supportive, that at least the feedback that we've gotten so far.
Do you envision the possibility of incorporating irrigation data based on the resolution of the aerial imagery we're getting, and also the methods that you guys have incorporated in this ET data sharing?
We don't have any plans on including the applied water or the irrigation data. This is really focused on just evapotranspiration. That said, I feel like if we did have a database of applied water or diversion data, that would be really useful for us to validate some of our models, just like with this pumpage data that I showed. But that data is few and far between in terms of getting it organized and readily accessible. It would be really useful for us, for sure.
Hey, Justin, it's Peter Callahan from the Internet of Water. Just curious about, and the last question was actually, sparks my own question. So it's Google Earth Engine that's taking care of the data management, the synthesis, cataloging, and production of these large, like, is there a data lake at Google Earth, or is it a federated system? And then if we were to create a federated catalog of all these other data sources, that's sort of our intent, which I'll talk about later today. Could it then be integrated through Google Earth, or could we think of other technologies that we might use for that?
Right now, Earth Engine is being used primarily for the compute and the fact that they have all the gridded climate data in addition to the remote sensing data that we need to do the integration and apply our algorithms. And then once we create those assets, those image assets of ET, we can use those assets anywhere else we want. So I feel like, perhaps a collaboration opportunity to where we not only post access to those image assets on Earth Engine, which we will certainly do. Like, here's your collection ID. Anybody can go use that stuff. They can also go download it. Anybody can. So I feel like there's a great opportunity there for many agencies to be able to leverage and use these data. I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, but maybe we can talk offline.
Before I introduce the next speaker, I wanted to ask about lighting. Does these need to be dimmed more? Yeah. All right, hold on. Next up is Dr. Marcus Beck from the Southern California Coastal Research Project. He will be presenting on the Southern Stormwater Monitoring Coalition Stream Quality Index.
All right, good morning. So my name is Marcus Beck. I'm with SQURP. Just a little background, if you don't know anything about SQURP, we basically, we sit at that nexus between the research community and the stakeholders, the managers that actually need the science to do their jobs better. So a lot of what we do is actually create sort of communication tools to actually translate the science, moving the data to information. And so that's really what this Stream Quality Index is all about. So I'm going to describe a little bit about the motivation behind it, how we think it could be used. It's a very brand new tool, so I'd love to hear from you guys maybe during the break about how you think you might use it. But again, yeah, this is a communication tool for data visualization to make information from data. So SQURP, we work with a lot of regulated parties, regulatory groups, to help them do their jobs better. And this particular tool, this index, was funded by the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition. This is a group that SQURP has been working with for several years now, and this was actually a group that was formed almost 20 years ago. That was basically a cooperative agreement between regulated regulatory groups with interest in stormwater management. And it's strictly a SoCal-oriented group. For the last 10 years, this group has actually been collecting data as part of their routine monitoring program, of which SWAMP is a part of, hence why I'm here today. But this is a great source of data. This is actually one of the most comprehensive sources of data for wadable streams in Southern California. And like most monitoring programs, this program is focused around some pretty general questions of understanding what the condition of the resources are, what sort of stressors are affecting those conditions, and how are things changing over time now that they've got about 10 years of data to look at trends and status. So yes, a great source of data, but it is data, not necessarily information based on the different questions you might want to ask. So they have challenges, really. I mean, they have lots of information about the physical, chemical, biological conditions, and they need to really evaluate those different lines of evidence in a lot of different ways to communicate the condition to different parties that they're working with. In the past, these different lines of evidence are really kind of evaluated individually, and a lot of times they might provide conflicting different pieces of information. So the biology might be good, but the stressors might be high and vice versa. So how do you sort of deal with that when you're looking at all these different things at once? And they've also kind of, not pointing any fingers here, but because there hasn't really been a comprehensive synthesis of these data, has kind of led to sort of subjective, irreproducible, and inadequate ways to sort of look at all these different lines of evidence to think about what's going on. And that's really the motivation of this particular index, is to sort of do this in an objective, reproducible, and adequate way. So this session is actually, focusing more on open science and data visualization. So I want to take a step back and think about how we can use open science in this broader context. So the SMC, given that they have all this data, they need to take this data and make actionable communication tools from it. And as scientists, I think our tendency is to say, I'm going to write a report, give it to you, wash my hands, and you do with it what you want. That's not really the most effective way to bring tools to the people that need it. In the research community, I think we have a tendency to think about research in this, this siloed process, this linear process where we're just following the scientific method as established and sort of making the report and walking away. Now, in the open science paradigm, there's just sort of realignment of how you think about research and how it's used by the people that need it, how you actually do applied research. So the research process is now open, hence the dotted line, and we're actually engaged in this two-way exchange of information with the folks that need the science to do their jobs better. In addition to that, we're doing things like putting data on open repositories, we're creating reproducible dynamic documents, we're making tools more accessible, we're creating interactive applications to put the data in the hands of the people that need it, put it at their fingertips, and we're bringing that back to the people full circle in this sort of two-way exchange of information. So making data into information with open science, that's this sort of broad concept that SCWRP is trying to adopt, but I think the SMC itself is also starting to think about in terms of how they're using their data. So that is the goal of this index, the Stream Quality Index. So it's an open communication tool that's meant to leverage multiple indicators, chemical, physical, and biological indicators, of which the SMC has a lot of. So a couple hallmark features of it. It is sort of linking quantitative, continuously measured indicators to categorical management options. So I'll explain a little bit what that means in a second. We're using biological response. We have biological indicators as our main response endpoint, and we're linking those different indicators to likely or unlikely stressors that we're seeing in the data sets. And we also wanted to preserve the underlying data. So we have these sort of high-level categorical outcomes that we're getting from the SQI, but we wanted to preserve the underlying information if someone wanted to do a deep dive to really think about or look at the actual underlying components of the index to sort of figure out what's driving the scores. So I'm going to go a little bit into the conceptual basis of this index, what you get from it as a user of this information. So the first thing you think about, or the first thing you see, is for any given site where you have biological data and stressor data, the SQI is going to put that into one of four categories based on the intersection of what the biology is telling you and how likely that biology is responding to stressors. So where you want to be basically, if we're interested in preserving the condition, is a healthy and unstressed community. So the biology is good, the stressors are low. In Southern California, we have a lot of these, impacted biological communities where the stressors are high. But going back to this concept of, what if you have conflicting lines of evidence? So what if the biology is impacted, but the stressors are low? Well, we have the category for that. We have an impacted by unknown stress site. And we have the converse where the biology is good, but the stresses are also high. So this is a resilient community. So we wanted to sort of keep those as endpoints where, we're not sort of averaging different lines of evidence. We're sort of preserving the underlying data to interpret what's going on. So this is the overall category you get from the SQI when you feed it the data. Now on the back end, we have this biological condition category as well. We're here, we're using two different biological indicators here to assess the condition. So we have the CSCI, which is a benthic macroinvertebrate index. And then we have the ASCII, which is an algae-based index. And so we can use those two quantitative indices to look at the agreement between those two things, the disagreement between them, and sort of the converses as well. So we have both indices are good, it's a healthy condition, both are impacted or impacted for either the CSCI or the ASCII. So again, this is a second level category you can get from the SQI to tell you what's going on with the biology. And then the last piece of the puzzle is the stressor condition. So just like the overall SQI and the biological condition, we've broken the stressors down into different categories of low stress, stressed by both things, and then stressed by one of them at a time. And so we have as our stressor indicators chemistry stress, water quality indicators related to eutrophication primarily, and then physical habitat stressors looking at the in-stream habitat as well as the riparian condition. This one's kind of interesting. We have this fifth category of stressed by low levels of both chemistry and physical habitat. So we've actually designed this in a way to where the stresses are additive. So if you have low levels of both, sometimes the additive combination of those two can push you into that stressed category. So this is a high-level look at the SQI. Just to sort of look at that a little bit deeper, this is sort of the same setup I just showed you on the last slide, where you have your overall SQI condition in the four categories there, your biological condition here based on the CSCI and ASCII, the four categories for that, and then the stressor condition, which takes a little bit more explaining, but basically we have, again, our chemistry, water chemistry stressors related to nitrogen, phosphorus, and conductivity as sort of primary biostimulatory eutrophication related factors, and then our habitat-related stressors related to CRAM, which is that sort of index of riparian condition, and then PHAB, which is a measure of the in-stream habitat. And so I'll talk about this in a second, but basically we related these stressors to biology as our endpoint. And we have these separate indices, our chemistry index and our habitat index, which basically is a quantitative measure of the likelihood of a site being impacted for biology relative to the chemistry or physical habitat stressors. So these are the categories we get from our stressors, and then bring it all together. This is the framework for the SQI. So again, you get these categories on the back end that really are easily interpretable. They preserve all of the bits of information describing the biology and the stressors. That's great. But this is a quantitative index, so I'm going to explain a little bit about what that means. This is based on an empirical model. We're using continuously based indices and scores and measures of habitat. How do we combine that in a way to get those categories that are easily digestible? So again, we're using biology as our endpoint, and we're modeling the likelihood of observing altered biology as a function of the stressors. Well, the first thing we had to do was take our biological indicators, our CSCI and ASCII, take those continuous scores and convert them into categories that we were then going to model the likelihood of falling into individual categories. So this is kind of a matrix that we came up with, and this looks familiar. This is actually our biological condition categories that you get at the back end, but we actually used these categories and modeled them as a function of the stressors that we saw in the stream related to chemistry and physical habitat. So in the columns, we have our CSCI scores broken up into categories, basically binning the continuous scores into different levels of alteration. Same thing for the algae here, and then sort of the combination of the two indices. So a site could fall into any one of these quadrants. And so to develop these empirical models, we said, of all the sites that we're looking at, how likely is something to be in this impacted for both category versus impacted, healthy for both versus impacted for either or both of those indices. And so we did that, again, looking at how chemistry and physical habitat and the additive combination of those things affected the biology. So we had some pretty simple logistic regression models that said, well, based on these categories, how likely is biology going to be altered by nitrogen, phosphorus conductivity for the chemistry, CRAM and IPI for the physical habitat, and then for both, which is just the multiplicative combination of the two. Okay? And so then these models gave us continuous probabilities of how likely a site was going to be altered by either of those things or both of those things. And we get a plot like this, which basically shows this is our likelihood of chemistry alteration, likelihood of physical habitat alteration, and then each one of these points is an individual site, and where it lies in this two-dimensional plane is the overall likelihood of being affected by both. And so we essentially just cut this up into quadrants to define our stressor categories of impacted for both, impacted for neither, impacted for chemistry, habitat, and then impacted by low levels of both. So that's how we got there, right? So that's our quantitative approach, and I'm just going through this to sort of make you believe me that this is an empirical model. These categories aren't just pulled out of thin air. So that's what you get. There's a model underneath the hood, but at the end you get these categories that people can see and they understand, and that's great. So we applied this to Southern California. The SMC, as I said earlier, has a great data set to use for developing this index. And if you're familiar with Southern California, you know that there are some pretty severe development gradients down there. So high elevation areas are undeveloped mostly, but these low elevation areas down by the coast, basically Los Angeles happens, San Diego's there, but they collect data in all of these locations. So we wanted to calibrate the index with this data from the SMC and see what it looked like. So basically, I know it's a little hard to see, but on the top here, this is our overall SQI results. These are our biological condition results, and these are our stressor condition results in the different categories that I explained. And essentially, you know, the story is pretty what we expected. So we have a large majority of sites in this kind of impacted and stressed condition, less sites in this unstressed and healthy condition, and then a handful of sites in these sort of oddball categories of stressed but the biology was good, or the biology is impacted but the stresses were not really there. So that was sort of an academic exercise looking what the data distribution was like. But the really cool part about this, and I think this is where this is really most important for you guys, is that we developed an online application to sort of showcase how we can bring this data, bring this model to the users that need it to help them make decisions. And so we developed an R Shiny app to do this, where basically you go to this landing page, you see this overall map, the condition categories that I talked about, you can get an idea of what's going on large scale in the landscape. You can click on an individual point and sort of see what the scores are for that particular location. So you get a GIS map of the land use around it, you get the condition categories, so the overall SQI impacted and stressed, the biological condition, ASCII impacted, and then which stressors are affecting it. And then going back to preserving the underlying data on the back end, we have these dials that show the actual raw data inputs that are used or that are available for a particular site. So we have these dials for the different indicators, the biology, chemistry, and stressors. So we also have some context for this too. If you were here last year, I talked about the SCAPE tool that was basically a model that lets you really understand a range of expectations for a biological index as a function of land use. And so we actually embedded this tool into the SQI to provide that context, because a huge complaint we got was, well, all of my sites are red. What do I do with that? Well, you can actually look at this context from SCAPE and say, well, this is the expected range of scores you can get from the land use, but your score is actually right up here. So in this case, you're actually doing quite good. You're over scoring based on what the land use should be constraining the channel for. So that's in there. If you click on a site, you see those range of expectations. Now, this is a brand new tool, so we're still sort of figuring out how we want folks to use it, or how folks should be using it or could be using it. But by and large, we think it's really something that is best used as a high-level screening tool for communication. Any sort of major management decisions coming out of it will, of course, require more careful analysis of the data, maybe site visits, that sort of thing. Because it does rely on 3 different lines of evidence, physical, chemical, and biological, if you're missing one of those things, you don't get the whole picture. So there are there's a high bar for the data going into it, but I think that, you know, over time, as the SMC collects more data, as we get better at compiling that information, a lot of those challenges will be resolved. And this is, by its nature, a Southern California tool. We are thinking about ways to expand it to the rest of the state. It's not a difficult challenge, but it just requires different calibration sets for the model to sort of tailor it for different regions where different stressors are present. Now, in terms of using it, again, we see this as a communication tool. And I'm just sort of putting out some ideas out there to sort of get people thinking about how they might use it, but some ideas that we had was, well, because this is a pretty high-level communication tool, this could be something that can maybe help engage the public through, say, watershed report cards, that sort of thing. We've also seen within the SMC, it's also enhancing dialogue among the folks within the SMC because they can, actually see the data and how they're actually sort of matched up and get a better understanding of it that way. So we think this can really go a long way to actually enhancing dialogue among stakeholders. And ultimately, we're hoping that this actually could be a tool that could be used for prioritization. So you have all those red sites, you have all those green sites, but what about those oddball categories? Maybe those are scenarios where you want to think about restoration or protection or other priorities. So we're thinking about that as we move into the future for how this could be used. And I pose this question to you guys: how would you use the SQI? We have a break coming up, so feel free to come and chat with me if you have some ideas about how you might use it. We're just now rolling this out, so we're sort of thinking about how people might be using it in an actual applied setting. So with that, I think I'm out of time, but I'm glad to take some questions. We have some other products. We have, in addition to the website, we have a fact sheet that's out now. We're working on a report and a manuscript for this as well, so we're going live with it as we speak. So thank you.
Hi, thank you. Carolyn Geno, City of San Diego. Seems like a really great tool, but obviously, like you said, there's a lot of data getting fed into something that then is useful and has applications. That data is expensive to collect, so I was just curious, especially if you were going to expand statewide, where does the funding come from to collect the data you need in all of these different areas to make the tool work, right?
So the SMC is basically a collaboration of a lot of different regional institutions, as you probably know. And so SCORP's involvement with the SMC is we sort of coordinate the monitoring. We don't actually do the monitoring. So we're actually leveraging a lot of the resources that sort of are collectively pooled from all of the member agencies within the SMC. Now, thinking about, because they do spend a lot of money collecting the data, they were like, well, we want to, show some value in this. And so that's why they came to SCORP and said, well, how do we actually make sense of all these data? And so we're actually more in the role of kind of converting the data to information, whereas we weren't actually the ones that funded the monitoring. Now, in terms of applying it elsewhere, this is sort of my opinion where I think we're more and more moving into the realm of we're just more data rich rather than data poor. So I see sort of, data, the right type of data is always going to be a challenge, but at least with broad tools like this that speak to sort of high level, Port of Cologne, Clean Water Act requirements, biological, physical, chemical stuff, this type of tool will become, I think, more and more valuable as, we just have the right type of information to help answer these broad level questions.
What components of CRAM did you use in your PHAB model?
So we actually used all four. There's the biological structure, physiological structure, hydrological structure, and buffer landscape structure, I believe. And the empirical model itself was actually built on a model selection procedure to create the most parsimonious model. And we actually fed it everything in CRAM, and then when it was done, it sort of spit out some things that was most important. So there's the actual pieces that are used to develop the empirical model, but on the dashboard itself, you can actually look at the available data that actually is provided for a site. So you can pull up the overall CRAM score as well as the individual components to maybe do a deeper dive and look at which pieces of information are maybe related to or potentially driving that condition.
Hi, John Hunt. So the EPA and others are advancing a financing scheme for large water quality improvement projects where the initial funding would come from private capital or a green bond or an environmental impact bond. and the investors who put up the money get paid back by a municipality, say, based on performance. And so they're looking for third-party evaluators and performance indicators that can be used in a pay-for-performance model. If you achieve these indicators, you get paid back for your bond investment. Can you see this index being used as a pay-for-performance measure that could be used in that sort of a contract?
Potentially. We are trying to be really careful in saying that this is not really something that's going to be used in a regulatory setting, but it could support types of activities like you're talking about. One way we're actually thinking about rolling this out is this index is going to be part of the next 5-year report for the SMC, and so we're hoping by doing that we can get some more coverage, as well as sort of thinking about how it could support other sort of actions or activities like you're talking about. So it can go a long way in that regard. We're certainly open to ideas about how it could be applied. And again, going back to what I was saying, I don't think it's necessarily detailed enough to be used in a regulatory setting, but could certainly support those types of activities or be served as a dialogue enhancing tool to sort of think about different context for those things. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for having me here. It's good to be here. So I'm just going to give a kind of a high-level view of USGS open science practices in the past, and then what we're transitioning to now as we modernize some of our databases and go through an example of data science. So that's a quick outline. I'm going to keep moving. So back in the day, USGS collected stream gauge data. I'm in the water mission area, so I'm focused in on water data. We were established about over 100 years ago, and this example on this slide is from Alameda Creek at Niles, which has been around more than 100 years. And we've always published our methods for measuring or collecting whatever data it is that we're publishing. So up here is the publication that governs how we compute discharge at our stream gauging stations. There are more since then as we've added modernized technologies to measure stream flow, but this is the grandfather, if you will. And then these pictures are showing, these graphs are showing over 100 years of stream flow data. The top one shows the daily mean stream flow over more than 100 years, and the bottom one shows the annual peak stream flow. So it's just an example of what we used to publish all the way back to the 1920s. We would annually produce approved time series data, essentially, of mostly stream flow, at least from the water mission area perspective. And here's in the lower left an example of one of those older reports. And again, this is Alameda Creek at Niles. So USGS was established as a whole back in 1879. And I've highlighted in yellow the key pieces of our mission statements, both for the overall USGS, the top one where it says we want to make our data sets accessible by federal, state, and local agencies, and the private sector and the public. So that has governed our data collection and dissemination since inception. And then the lower mission statement is just for the Water Resources Division, and we are still focusing on delivering unbiased information to the public and our stakeholders. So that's the historical context for our open science initiative in general. And then skipping forward, I've only been with the USGS for 13 years, so that's back in 2006 that I started. So before I even got there, we moved to disseminating our data online because the internet was invented. So we also moved away from this annual cycle of data approval before we disseminated it, and we started releasing provisional data. And here's just a snapshot of our network. And we call this the National Water Information System, or NWIS. We have 10,300 and some odd real-time stream gauges. That's the lower image there, and the color coding is showing some statistical reference with the percentiles of flow. You can see that was from last Friday, and a lot of the Midwest is flooding with the blue and black colors of the stream gauges. We have about 1,700 real-time groundwater sites. That's in the upper right, that image. And so we have some long-term gauges there where we can also look at the statistical reference of the percentile of the water level. And then we also have 2,100 real-time water quality sites. That's the lower left image. Oh no, that's the stream gauge. That's the upper left image, and that's just showing temperature. And it is also showing a reference of whether or not it's high or low temperature on that image. We also have about over 400,000 sites where we've collected at least one discrete water quality sample. And that is a huge beast. Just in California, our NWIS water quality discrete database has over 4 million results in it. So let's move forward. So this is what NWIS looks like kind of under the hood. So we've got the groundwater and site information database, which is, if you're going to start collecting data at any site, you have to start with this piece of NWIS. This is a federated database, so all these pieces feed into the main NWIS. And then once you establish that site, you can start collecting more data there. You can do a time series, which is what all of our discharge network sites are, or you can do discrete sampling, which is what QW data is. That's our internal reference to it. And then all of those feed in to our federated NWIS platform, which you see as a user online. We store metadata in each of those chunks of NWIS. Whether or not the user can get at the metadata is another question. I would argue that the time series database needs some enhancements there. We don't share all the metadata that we collect, like our field visit readings that go into the uncertainty analysis that we're kind of trying to work on building into that database. That's not available to the public, but I believe that it should be made public. You can get some uncertainty information and some data collection methodology information out of QW data. I'll go through an example with that. But another great thing about NWIS is that it's interoperable with just about any stats package or code that you want to use to extract data. I skipped over the piece where people are collecting data, and we have quality assurance and workflow tools that are built and supported institutionally, which is essential to have a routine method that you can name, code, and enter into the database, and then quality assure accordingly. And the quality assurance methodology is also public information. So now that's just a kind of a brief overview of where we are. I skipped over a piece where NWIS time series is yellow because we've modernized that database. We are thinking about and working on modernizing QW data as well. And that's a big project that's going to probably finish in the next 5 years. And then moving on to our current priorities, so the now piece of this talk, we are thinking about organizationally continuing that effort of modernizing all the pieces of NWIS, which is a huge job. And then a part of it that I'm going to demonstrate with a kind of a data use story today is thinking about this water prediction work program, or we're calling it 2WP, where the vision is to take our national network scale of data, and in cases of sediment or mercury, nutrients, those are priority constituents that we're interested in putting together regression models that can estimate those concentrations in near real time as a first step, and then move toward eventually forecasting those constituent concentrations into the future. So thinking about that as my data science question with our current status of NWIS modernization is what the rest of this talk goes through. So starting again with Alameda Creek at Niles, this is a site map. The blue is the creek. We're in the Bay Area. That gauge has been around since 1891. It's operated by our Santa Cruz field office. We are in partnership with the San Francisco Public Utility Commission to collect the stream flow, and we're in partnership with Alameda County Flood Control and Water Conservation District to collect sediment data, discrete samples. And we've been collecting those data since late 1950s for suspended sediment concentration and bed load since in 1999. This is an important steelhead fishery. There is interest in restoration in this watershed, and it's a flashy urban stream, and I emphasize that point because the next piece of my talk emphasizes fitting models to flashy urban systems and or headwater systems. So this is a picture of Alameda Creek at Niles during the 2017 large flow events that we all experienced. Lou Canarosi operates this site out of Santa Cruz, so he took this picture, and that is showing 1,300 CFS, cubic feet per second, 4,100 milligrams per liter of suspended sediment, and about 89,000 tons per day on that particular day, sediment loading. So my question is, can I use some hydrologic index terms that I can derive from approved streamflow data and apply it to this national network scale emphasis that we're thinking about, at least starting with near real-time estimates of priority constituents, including sediment. So this is a workflow I just created in my head, because if we're going to do this on a national scale, it's a large beast, and if we can emphasize a workflow that everybody's going to use, it makes things more routine, more defensible, more reproducible. So my question was, can I put these terms that I've found to fit these constituents and models into our NWIS time series database now that it's modernized? And that's the piece up here where I'm thinking about, does this fit here, or does this eventually fit in an archive, a code repository, where I derive them in a code and just leave them in a repository instead of in the cloud, which is part of our infrastructure of the modernized NWIS time series database. Do we have enough space in the cloud? All of those questions start to come into play. So I'll kind of walk through this workflow as I keep going with this talk. So I'm at Alameda Creek at Niles. I'm thinking, can I fit the sediment concentration with some derivatives of approved stream flow that people are already collecting? It's basically free data to me. What can I do with these data to model suspended sediment in near real time? So I start with 947 suspended sediment samples. I use the USGS data retrieval package and the stats package to pull those out of NWIS because it's interoperable. And then I hit a brick wall because there are some metadata in the data, in the sample data, that to me I understand because I have institutional knowledge. I've worked for USGS for 13 years, but I'm thinking of the perspective of a public data user when they encounter observer and A as part of a tag of a sample. What does that mean? So the answer is it's buried in a policy. And so again, having the institutional knowledge is key, but call us if you're using the data and you have a question like that. We do have mechanisms to answer questions from the public when they're scratching their head and wondering what's up with these metadata. So basically I had to work through this and split apart my data pre and post this policy and come up with a way to remove the opportunity for serial correlation in my model with samples that were too close together in the pre-2012 data. And then I could use this A, which means average of 5 bottles that were dipped in the stream at 5 different places. I split out those in my post-2012 data because those were the ones I was interested in using in my calibration data set. So I started with 640 samples after 2012, and I ended up with 204 once I removed samples that were individual dips in the middle or different places in a channel. So I ended up with 478 samples, but it also gave me my prediction data set, my calibration data set, but also my holdout samples, which is my validation data set, because all those individual dips could be used, or all those ones that were too close together could be used to validate the samples, or the model. So that's just kind of a story in one slide of some of the things you encounter when you're doing data science with this huge network of sites, especially legacy sites that have been around for 30, 100, 50 years, et cetera. So then I moved to R and did, or I was still in R, and did the regression analysis to see if these index terms, which I've kind of glossed over until now, could help fit the most extreme flashy events that move the most stuff. The first one is a hysteresis term. It's at the top. And it's just basically taking today's daily mean flow relative to the previous n-day mean flow. So you subtract that number from today's daily mean, and it can fit a model when you have hysteresis effect in transport. The range Q term I came up with on my own because I was working in a different model where mercury was the constituent of concern, and it was a flashy system where you could have a huge range in flow over a time frame shorter than a day. So I figured if you took that range and you divided by the daily mean and you got something close to or greater than 1, that could be a really good way to fit a model to those flashy events. And it turns out it is. So this is just me using a stepwise regression code in R. You don't need to read all that stuff, but it spits out all the different model options and what is the best one, and that helps you select the right one. So I came up with that model. There's just a one-to-one line. It's still in log space, but the model is looking pretty decent on that plot. The model is explaining about 83% of the sample variability and suspended sediment concentration. I did prove to myself that I can compute the explanatory variables in our modernized time series database, thereby making them potentially publicly available to all people that want to model anything at any of our sites. If I was following that workflow, my next step would be to assess the validation samples. Do they fit with the model? Produce a model archive summary and have that peer reviewed. And then I would have to assign metadata to those indices to describe what exactly they are, how did I compute them, and compute prediction intervals in the model and put that out on another tool that I'll summarize in a second. And that's it. NRTWQ, that stands for National Real-Time Water Quality. So this is just an example of a model in Oregon computing suspended sediment concentrations in real time, and the visualization tool. The gray here is an uncertainty band. It's a 90% prediction interval. The red are samples that statistically 10% of them will fall out of that uncertainty band. So you see one that did that right there. There's the hydrograph. It's shown on the right-hand y-axis. And there's our national coverage. It doesn't mean that's the only regression models we have. It just means those are the ones that we've posted on this website. Another thing I've heard people ask and talk about, probabilistic models. I didn't get a screenshot of it, but below, if you go on this website and you look at some of the models up there, and you scroll down below this graph, you will find a probability of exceedance. If there is a target of interest, like a regulatory target, and you're a decision maker, you can get you can add your own subjective sensitivity and pick out whether or not you want to take an action based on the probability of exceeding whatever the target is. And this is also a great tool because it has all the documentation. You can download data. You can look at the report that created the model or published the model of interest. So there's a lot of tools on this website. So last few questions before I end here. Thinking about this national push that USGS is interested in, starting with the near real-time estimation of constituents of interest across our national network. We have a modernized time series database, and we have data collection and QA workflows and publications in place. They're available to all. We are underway with modernizing the QW data, or the new name is going to be NWIS samples. But with some of those challenges with the metadata, is there an opportunity there to clean up the metadata and make it more discernible to any member of the public or data science community that's reading out the metadata and scratching their head and hitting that brick wall like I described. With any modernization effort, it's really important. We didn't do it when we modernized the time series database. We didn't do it very well, but we want to keep up with policy updates that match the modernized capability of the database. And that hopefully we do a better job when we're modernizing the samples with that. And we want to make our field data entry tools compatible with that modernized database. So those are some organizational challenges. And again, I'm speaking from a perspective of a national network. And I've been really inspired by some of the conversation that I've been a part of with the community here in California that's facing the open data mandate, thinking outside of the box and inspiring me to consider things like making our time series tagged with a digital object identifier and an ORC ID or ORCID or whatever you call that. That's a great way to track how many hits you're getting on your time series database, and we don't currently have that capability built into our modernization effort. So kind of missed the boat on that, but I'm trying to fix that internally. So a quick summary, the modernization efforts offer great potential to address challenges that you may face, but they also offer new opportunities like the modernized NWIS time series database to output these hydrologic indices, which happen to work quite well to fit a lot of constituent models. Stream flow, without it, you can't do much with much else in surface water world. So I'm really thankful to all the people that collect those data. Knowledge of our policy is needed to explain our long-term metadata, and this is a thing I think we should think about fixing as we migrate the samples to a new modernized database. And institutional support of workflows starting from the field through the QA and peer review, and then also R packages or Python packages and data and code repositories. Institutional support for those things is essential to support open science. That's all I've got. Do we have time for questions?
Hi, good morning. My name is LaDonna Williams, and I'm with a small nonprofit in Vallejo. And you mentioned that it has the ability to work with all constituents. So I was just wondering, what suggestions or advice would you give frontline environmental justice communities engaging in the science using this product to benefit our communities?
I would offer R. I'm fluent in R, the coding language that I use for this example, and we have a public GitHub. Somebody else mentioned GitHub earlier, so you can obtain all of our R packages that interface with NWIS. They have documentation and examples of how to use the code, so you can kind of like copy the code exactly and then replace it with your site of interest and your date range of interest, and then start getting the same data out of NWIS that you're interested in and plotting it and doing whatever else.
Is that a training or a workshop or some sort of engagement you can offer to the community and come and work with us to understand the process?
We have a lot of tools online. I would be interested in working with anybody to access that. I think the National Park Service, as far as a training, has made an open source R training that's available online. But that would be the only free one that I can think of off the top of my head. But that's a good idea.
Will data from the modernized NWIS be more comparable with data from the modernized version of CDN that's going to be coming out?
So, will you repeat that? Sorry.
So you're talking about NWIS data being modernized, or NWIS samples is going to be the new name. Are you guys touching base with people involved with the CDN modernization network?
Yes, I'm interested in doing that too. And coming up with I'm interested in coming up with a code also that could translate our NWIS data into CDN, however it needs to get translated to have the same bins of metadata or whatever the challenge might be. Yep, interested in that. Thank you. Mhm.
I will say to both those things, first to the question in the back, there is a National Water Quality Monitoring Council that has a specific work group for volunteer and citizen monitoring, as well as the California Water Quality Monitoring Council has a citizen or a community water science representative, and one of those events is happening tomorrow. There's a whole workshop on kind of the basics, but we're trying to kind of build a survey. There's a survey out there as well that you can take that kind of helps us answer those questions, like what are the needs and how can we help address those. And then for the CDN modernization, all the NWIS data is available on the National Water Quality Portal, which CDN actually feeds into. So that's kind of the central location where we're kind of building those tools to make sure that those are integrating and federating properly. So next up, we have Joel Kramer and Gino from Weston Solutions.
Morning, everybody. My name is Joel Kramer. I'm from Weston Solutions. We're located in San Diego. And today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of people have been inferring, but how do you get the information, the scientific information, really readily available to members of the public so that it's useful to them? And so this is a data visualization tool you may be familiar with. It's called an Esri story map. And we put one together based on the needs of a municipality in Oceanside, California, for some water quality impacts. But just a little bit about our background. I've worked with nonprofits, doing a lot of community engagement around water quality monitoring and habitat restoration.
And I'm Gino, and I've done a lot of work with phycology, mainly with harmful algal blooms and other transient systems. So I'm very familiar with how these interact with public health and how you can sort of relate toxicity data to the general public.
So just a little bit about a story map. There's a lot of different ways of communicating data, but we chose a story map because we wanted something that would be really easy to take in and interactive so that people aren't just looking at the data, but they're actually absorbing it and seeing how it relates to their lives. And story maps have that capability. They're also really easy to use, put together, and look at. And lastly, they're very accessible. So we designed one with a format that's easily scrollable on your cell phone. So anybody can really take a look at it. It doesn't take a lot of time or the right equipment to look at. So just a little bit of orientation. Again, this is done in partnership with the city of Oceanside. And the location is the Loma Alta Slough. It's one of many coastal estuaries on the San Diego coastline. And it's highly urbanized. So there's a lot of water quality impacts upstream that affect the slough, which is right at the mouth of the ocean. So some of those impacts that you can see here, and this is one example of a map that a community member, while looking at this presentation, wouldn't just look at it, they'd be able to zoom in, see which areas they like to visit, where they might live, and where they are in relation to this place. So some of the impacts that they might be contributing to that affect the slough are bacteria levels coming from upstream, or nutrient levels that affect algal blooms, and also by the fact that it's heavily urbanized, there's a lot of habitat loss there. And so all these things contribute to water quality impacts in the slough itself. In response to this, the City of Oceanside has taken many initiatives, some of which we'll be talking about in detail in terms of the scientific studies, and the bulk of which are monitoring nutrients and flow in the tributaries leading into the slough, as well as algal monitoring during the growth period and in summertime, bacteria monitoring, and tracking using genetic markers to see which species the bacteria might be coming from and which tributaries they might be coming from, and also a habitat restoration plan with funding from the State Coastal Conservancy. And all of these are in the effort to improve water quality throughout the watershed, but particularly at the slough.
So there are a variety of complex factors that go into inducing algal growth. So we've created this schematic to sort of present this, the different inputs and factors that go into inducing algal growth in the Low Malta Slough in a public-friendly and easy-to-follow format. So to begin with, there's 2 upstream tributaries that feed into it. During the wet season, which is from October to May in Southern California, the slough flows freely into the ocean. However, during the dry season, there's a sand berm that forms and closes off the slough, retaining the same parcel of water inside that area. And so with the berm closed, nutrient inputs from industrial, agricultural, and residential runoff collect inside the slough, and this is conducive to algal growth. Also, the summer months experience increased sunshine, which also it promotes algal growth. Along with the increased sun warming the surface of the water and evaporating the surface, causing higher salinities, which is associated with different conditions that don't allow certain plants and aquatic species to thrive inside this body of water. So here, scientists at Weston Solutions began to monitor for the abundance of algae in the slough in 2016. Here we have a map of algal cover in 2016. Monitoring occurs twice a year during the summer growth periods from July to August. So we've created these maps to try in an interactive format so the concerned citizen can scroll around and see where algal concentrations might be the highest during the summer months. And so this next map here is from 2017. Scientists at Weston Solutions measure the surface area of the slough covered by algae along with the actual concentrations at certain various sampling points. And so this monitoring program is to help the City of Oceanside determine if conditions are improving in the slough. The next map shows 2018. This monitoring program is to continue until 2020. So while the study isn't done, we find it important in the spirit of transparency to present these results to the public as the data becomes available to keep them informed. And so the objective of these maps is to portray the results of the study and hope that the site visitor can see that algal cover is being reduced over time. We've also, a microbial source tracking study was done in the Low Malta Slough and the upstream tributaries, and identified local genetic markers from humans, coastal birds such as cormorants and seagulls, and dogs. And the data, these maps are shown in a informative and friendly format, so they show the seasonal changes in bacteria concentrations and the various sources of fecal bacteria within this watershed. So the Low Malta watershed, the Low Malta Slough is located in the Low Malta watershed, which is one of the many coastal watersheds in northern San Diego County. So different During the dry season, which again is from June to September, you can see that higher concentrations are found closer to the mouth of the slough, and that there's lower concentrations in the upstream tributaries, which is correlated with the intensity and color. And here you can see that very few areas had significant levels of bacteria, with only one catchment shown as the red polygon there, having any detectable concentrations of fecal indicator bacteria. In this case, it was all from human sources. Now during the wet season, which is from October through May, bacteria concentrations increase throughout the watershed relative to the dry period. And so you can see here that moderate to high concentrations are found in the watershed, again corresponding with color, which could possibly be from runoff and flushing of areas adjacent to the stormwater conveyance system in the surrounding watershed. And here you can see that the areas highlighted are where bacteria from human, dog, and coastal birds were found. So there was genetic markers detected in all of these areas. And the next area here shows that this particular section, only the human marker was found. It's clear of both bird and dog fecal indicator bacteria. And here you can see that the sections closest in the mouth of the slough to the left only had genetic markers for human and coastal birds, whereas only humans and dogs were found in the upper eastern portion of the watershed. And so narrowing down how these, where the speciation of fecal indicator bacteria helps inform where bacteria may be coming from and how to reduce it. So, for example, these maps are in an interactive format, and so a concerned citizen can scroll around and see where the areas that they interact with and try to see where the potential sources of bacteria may be coming from. For example, if a concerned citizen views this website and sees that their neighborhood has a large indicator of dog fecal indicator bacteria, they can infer that there's an illicit discharge of pet waste somewhere in their neighborhood and take steps to mitigate that, either by increasing awareness and making sure to properly dispose of their pet waste. And so this is just one example of how upstream non-point sources can affect water quality downstream in the same watershed.
So knowing that non-point sources can overwhelm a water body and that they largely collect at the bottom, it becomes extremely important to ensure the health of that downstream ecosystem, and that's the slough. And so to address that, the City of Oceanside has applied for funds and received funds from the State Coastal Conservancy to design a habitat restoration plan for 4 acres of habitat there. And this is very exciting because not only does it provide more opportunities for the public to interact with the space through wildlife viewing and trail use, but it actually addresses the water quality issues that they're contributing to upstream. So the bacteria or the nutrients that are being currently flushed downstream or contributing to algal growth can be now absorbed by wetland vegetation downstream, in addition to increasing tidal flushing and circulation and residence time from removing the berm and connecting it to the ocean. So habitat restoration both improves the ecosystem, but by discussing it in an open way like this, it allows for opportunities to bring the public more and have a greater community impact through a project like this. And toward that end, the City of Oceanside is working with other organizations throughout the watershed. There's citizen groups and other municipalities that share the watershed. And so the city has an outreach program, they have a volunteer program, but beyond that, a tool like this allows them to share the tool with other partner organizations so that they can get their constituency involved too and create a broader network. So one example here is the Audubon Society, because coastal estuaries provide important bird habitat for migratory birds, and so someone who might not be involved with the city could still gain interest through their local organization. But in addition to monitoring algae and addressing bacteria issues and expanding habitat, the city has been taking other initiatives to improve water quality. a lot of that has to do with monitoring stormwater outfalls or industrial inspections. And in addition to that, it's also extremely important to conduct education and outreach. And so the city regularly holds events, whether volunteer events or outreach events, to teach people about how their lifestyle choices, such as maintaining their pet waste or the nutrients they put into the lagoon through fertilizers, can affect the slough that they like to enjoy. And so we thought it was important that for a tool like this, you try to not just empower people with information, but with things they can do. And so it's easy to link in opportunities of upcoming events and different ways that people can get involved. And since it's an online tool that can be viewed on your cell phone, it's easily linkable to ways for people to actually report pollution or littering or irrigation runoff, and is integratable in that way, whereas a scientific report just doesn't have the integration for that. And lastly, this is meant to be a bridge. As you can see, it's very basic information, but all of the results of the studies are public, and so we link through this tool to actual reports online, specifically through Project Clean Water. For those who are interested but would like to learn more, they now have a superficial education about the topic and maybe will be better equipped to deal with scientific jargon that is available online. And so, in summary, the story map is a way of equipping people, whether it's a government agency or just a community group, to actually make maps and data interactive and easily available in a way that doesn't just show people information but allows them to take ownership of it. And it's easily updatable such that a citizen monitoring program would be able to continue to add information to it that would then be available on that story map. So we just want to keep encouraging the ready accessibility of information to the public. If anyone has any questions, we've got a little time.
Hi, Zach Bradford, League to Save Lake Tahoe. You mentioned citizen monitoring, but it sounds like you haven't gotten to the citizen science, citizens submitting data quite yet. Have you guys looked at protocols and started thinking about how to train volunteers and get them to enter data real time? Is that kind of part of the next steps?
That would be an effort by the city of Oceanside. So since we're the consultant, we're helping with the actual scientific studies, but we definitely would encourage that. Citizens can provide much more regular data than we might be able to.
Hi, are you aware of another way to do that aside from the Esri format? Is there another way to provide that interactive map and information with pictures aside from I guess it's an Esri, it's a portal, is that right? Or is it a story? What is the format, and is there other ways to do it?
Yeah, so Story Map is essentially just a website that is can easily be composed, and it is free and available through Esri, although some features are limited to actual subscribers to Esri products. You could do it in lots of other ways. There's, I could imagine making a Google map or a Google Earth map, but I don't think it would have the same interactiveness, or at least the appearance, and I don't know how easily it would appear on someone's phone or, yeah, so there's additional features here that, because Esri is a mapping organization, it works better for spatial information.
To add on to that, I know that you can integrate it with R or Python and create interactive maps, but it still requires you to have a ArcGIS license. But in this case of creating an Esri story map, like Joel had mentioned, it's generally free. There are some limitations if you end up using the free version of ArcGIS Online, but you can still create something similar with like an interactive map and, scrolling presentation.